Hi, it's the fifth Sunday after Pentecost, and I thought I'd share a video reflection on the scriptures that have been suggested for churches to look at this Sunday. The first reading is from Genesis chapter 2, verse 1 to 14, and the second reading, the Gospel reading, is from Matthew chapter 10, verse 40 to 42. Both of those readings are following on from the sections that we've been looking at for the last few weeks. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those and then start the video again. During the weeks after Pentecost, we've been following the story of Abraham and Sarah and their family. We heard about God calling them out of their home in the city to wander as guests in the land of the Canaanites. And we heard about God appearing to them in their camp in the form of a group of guests and promising them a son. Last week we heard about the conflict between Sarah and her slave Hagar, both of whom had borne children with Abraham. And we heard about Abraham sending Hagar and her son Ishmael away into the wilderness. This week we've heard the story of the binding of Isaac. I'm wondering how you feel about this week's story and what you do with this story. Because last week's story was confronting, but this week's story is horrific, with God now telling Abraham to sacrifice his remaining son, Isaac. Abraham obediently takes Isaac on a 3-day journey to the top of a mountain, the place where heaven and earth meet. And it's only at the last moment that God tells Abraham not to sacrifice his son, providing a sheep as an alternative sacrifice. When hearing this story, I think it's baffling that Abraham would be this obedient. How could he do this? And it also leads us to ask how God could ask this, why God would ask Abraham to do such a terrible thing. It seems as though in that part of the ancient world, this was the kind of test that a king would give to one of his underlings as a test of their loyalty, demanding that a less powerful local noble abase themselves to show his loyalty to the king. And it seems that Abraham is going along with what God has asked in order to show his loyalty to God, knowing that this is a test and expecting that his son's life will be spared if he goes along with it. This might explain something that ancient hearers of the story would have understood, but we're still left with more questions. Do we think that God is like a king lording over us, demanding that we abase ourselves to show our loyalty? And how would Isaac have been impacted by his father's willingness to commit a terrifying act of violence against his own son for his God? And where is Isaac's mother, Sarah, in all of this? How is she impacted by it? It's not included in the lectionary reading, but just after this story, we're told about Sarah's death. And I wonder, was it the shock of her husband's willingness to sacrifice her son that killed her? So what do we do with this story? Should we even read it? Does it have anything redeeming in it? It's certainly not a nice story, but perhaps sometimes our experience of God might seem like this. Sometimes it might seem that we can't fathom what God is doing. Sometimes we'll be terrified by what God seems to be asking us to do. Sometimes we'll have grievances with God. Sometimes we'll have grievances with God's people because of what they're willing to do in God's name. It's legitimate to question how a just God can allow suffering and violence in the world, especially when suffering and violence is inflicted in the name of God. Our experience as human creatures is that life and death come together. Our living is dependent on the death of other creatures that have experienced death so that we can be nourished. Animals like the sheep in the story, and plants like the wheat and the grapes that are ground and crushed to make the Lord's Supper that churches share. If we say that God is sovereign, then it's God who gives life and God who takes it away. If we say that God is sovereign, God is responsible for all the joy and the grief that's entailed in human life. The Christian witness is that God is not just sovereign over life and death, but that in the person of Jesus, God also joins us in the human experience of mortality. God knows what it's like to be human, to live and work and die, to celebrate and to grieve. In the section that we've been hearing from Matthew's Gospel, Jesus has been saying, just before the previous Sunday we would have heard this, he's been saying that he cares for the smallest creatures, little birds, and that he cares what they're experiencing, and that he cares for us, knowing us intimately, knowing the number of hairs that we have in our heads. God is not just the ruler measuring out life and death. God sees and cares for us small creatures. God is with us in our joy and suffering, joining us in solidarity. In the midst of joy and suffering, God asks that human beings care for the small and vulnerable among us too, joining and supporting them in their joy and struggles.